I recently learned saying good morning is actually inappropriate today. I also apologize, my voice is a little hoarse. It's what happens at conferences, you yell so people can hear you. And so the lozenges they're starting to work, so I apologize in advance for that. So today we're gonna be talking about snooping on cellular gateways, but first I'm curious, how many people are knowledgeable that we have hydrogen cars? Hydrogen cars driving around the country, driving around Europe. It's random, but I'm just curious. It's just a poll I'm running. So, my name is Justin Shattuck. I work for F5 Labs within F5 Networks. We essentially are a voice of security for F5 Networks as a whole. Prior to coming to F5 Labs, I actually was the manager of services engineering. We built the Silverline DDoS scrubbing service and web application firewall for F5 Silverline. Prior to that, I've been essentially a developer for product security or security products for about 15 years. And I also help co-author with Sarah Bodie, the Hunt for IoT reports. We're now approaching our 5th volume. So today we're going to talk about essentially how we discovered some cellular gateways and a bunch of other things. What we did, we scanned them, which you could expect, the research we performed, why it's important, why we're here talking about it today, and some conclusions. So as any good security story starts, it was an interrupted vacation. You can tell I'm still a little bitter. I never got to finish my West veteran. So on October 22nd of 2016, everybody's probably familiar with on October 21st of 2016, we had the Dyn DNS attack. I was in Belgium, so it was October 22nd. That's the reason why the date seems a little skewy. So originally I was investigating or following up on an incident related to Bashlight. So I was expecting to see a DVR, and it was implanted essentially in a very large airport in Europe. Turns out it wasn't a DVR at all. So upon investigating the incident, looking into Bashlight, expecting to just find Bashlight and have another very boring day on October 22nd, turns out, it was a digital signage solution, actually. This is a very small part of the story, but it's very important. It was the arrivals and departures sign solution in front of this very large airport. This is very important. So we did a very quick disclosure. Call legal, I'm in Belgium, West Coast. Call legal, get advice from legal, think about it, hang up phone, call party responsible for host. Ended up having 39 actors on the host, and they very quickly unracked the box, pulled the drives and shipped them to us, which is amazing. I didn't ask for them, they just volunteered them. So we got to analyze those log files, and we ended up finding numerous shell shock attempts, which is pretty boring as well, overall, but we found a bunch of new variants of Mirai. And so really, this research is more about how we fell in, or how I fell into this research. So essentially, I was observing these packets being flung around the internet at whatever rates were coming out of these devices. We're all familiar with that, so what do? You scan. You scan, you scan, you scan, you find the results very interesting. And so, researchers, we like to rinse and repeat. This is with permission, luckily, fortunately, got to scan a lot. And so while inside this airport's network, we ended up finding 39 other threat actors. Numerous services and hosts are managed by a third party, weren't in fact managed by the airport at all. And then ultimately, we identified what we believed to be a Sierra wireless gateway. And so scanning this network, we stumbled upon the Sierra wireless gateway. And if you're not familiar with a cellular gateway, which I'm sure everybody in this room is, but my father isn't, and he may watch, I'm gonna explain it. So you have these little boxes, little black, blue, red, orange, whatever color you might want. They typically have 2 Ethernet ports. The ones we're specifically talking about have digital I/O, analog I/O, serial, 802.11x, usually 2 SIMs, so you have primary and backup for cellular interfaces. Numerous other options. I mean, there's a plethora of options. The point is, it's almost endless what you can connect these devices to. And so if you think about that, think about it. You can plug them into nearly anything. You might be able to see where we're going with this. So we started scanning. Originally, we searched Shodan, and what Shodan allowed us to essentially do is get a preview of what we could expect to find. So we started putting filters into Shodan, discovered where the Shodan results were, which was about 26,000 for just Verizon. And then we ended up using a data partner that we have for data called Lorica. And so we pulled in some scan data that Lorica was running for us. And from there, we were able to actually identify far more devices. There's quite a large difference in the devices that we were able to identify back in 2016 versus 2018, and essentially versus Shodan. So what you're looking at is essentially the original set of devices that we found back in 2016. The majority of them are all sitting on Verizon. There's actually a /9 that about 30%, I believe, of the Verizon modules or the Verizon radios are actually sitting on. So we broke it down by model. This is in no effort to pick on Sierra. However, we are listed only Sierra models. They have the LS300, the GX400, the 440s, 450s. And what it is we broke it down, essentially we discovered that the price points like the LS300 is one of their more affordable options. And so of course we're gonna see more of them. It's also older, it's been out longer. All the way through the newer enterprise edition stuff, like the 450s, the RV50s, there's less of them because there's less of them deployed. People typically want to go to the more affordable options. So this is a preview of what the scan data looked like as we focused on just the United States in 2016. So essentially, you have a dot. Everywhere we found Sierra wireless device. Now, the reality is this is not the geolocation of the device. Of course, it's the geolocation of the IP when we looked it up, but still relevant. And then the device distribution, fast forwarding into 2018. We have 86,237 devices we've identified in the US alone. 84% of all the devices we found have been found present in the United States. So we focus heavily on the United States, mostly because we understand the infrastructure. We understand the laws, the rules, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and essentially how we can go about doing it. So on July 30th, we essentially ran another scan right before coming to Black Hat, pulled the data from our scans to see how has it changed since the last time we looked 2 days prior. And this is actually representative of 105,000, just over 105,000 devices globally. The original, to jump back to 2016, it wasn't a surprise whenever we found the Bashlight incident, and it really wasn't a surprise when we found Mirai on the Sierra wireless device, because Sierra actually released multiple disclosures related to both their enterprise models, their consumer line models, so the GX, EX, LS series, back on October 4th and October 5th. Happy birthday to me then. They actually released it on my birthday. So beyond that, we have from the US CERT, they also issue a warning, which is very important at the bottom. But that was issued on October 12th. And the US CERT actually informed us then that there's no actual hardware or software vulnerability that is needed to be used to essentially use these devices for bad. I'm just summarizing what the CERT told us. And so we learned some lessons. With cellular, you burn some bandwidth. Initially, we focused only on the United States. We're fast forwarding now into 2018. In 2018, the scan results, on the numbers that you see for 2018, there's a big difference in 50,000 and 105,000. So you think, oh man, the problem's getting worse. It's doubled. This is horrible. It actually isn't necessarily worse. It isn't actually necessarily double. The numbers are double, but really we got more precise with the way that we were scanning. Instead of just scanning, looking at telnet banners and say port 9191, looking at what we could find over HTTP or HTTPS, we actually started analyzing more, looking at assets like banner images and copyright years and SSL certificates. So we got more and more clever about how we could find these resources. And then we even went beyond that. Unfortunately, we don't have enough room in the deck to fit it all in. Plus my PowerPoint skills are really weak. So you're not gonna find any year over year, no moving averages, nothing fancy, unfortunately, in these charts. The next step is we set up a lab. Now the lab setup was in July and August of 2017. We had the devices since 2016. The problem is once the devices were already known to spew packets and we were kind of bored. We set it down and we really weren't sure what we were going to be doing at that time. So literally just kind of left the scanners running, left all the data pipeline up and running, and then kind of walked away and just didn't really forget about it, but was like, okay, what else can we do? What else is going to happen? Apologies. So we really weren't sure what to expect. And in July, I remember we noticed something. We noticed essentially a data point change. And I don't want to spoil my own talk, but the data point essentially changed. So we pick it back up and we began researching it. So we set up a lab. We grabbed three models, which are essentially representative of the 3 different lines that Sierra offers. And so we kept those in scope. That's what we were focused on. We also discovered Digi devices, which we have up there as well. They are also vulnerable to weak authentication, username, password. And then there's the Moxa device, the G3XXX series, which is actually really funny because it's kind of more of a no scope, requires no authentication. So literally, If you're a gamer, you might get that joke. No scope hit, I guess. Here's the important part, exploiting the vulnerability. I'm sure many of you came in thinking that you were going to find CVEs, exploits, or some sort of POC code that's gonna, I don't know, help you own some gateways. There's no exploit needed. There's no vulnerability to exploit. There's no CVE we're actually tacking onto and taking advantage of to make this possible. We're literally just knowing that the username is user and the default password is 5 asterisks. But it's not 5 asterisks, it's a numeric sequence. It starts with a 1, hint, it ends in a 5. So you don't need to brute force. No need to find any innocent civilians to tap in usernames and passwords to manually brute force Sierra devices. You'll also notice there's a WAN IP. That's a really bad inside joke. The public GPS coordinates that you see at the bottom, in the bottom of the unauthenticated screen, you'll notice we're not logged in. I also don't own that IP. To give you an idea, these are those coordinates in our great friend Google Maps. Thank you, Google. Source credit Google Maps. So we actually were able to locate this. You can see that it has satellite fixes. There's 10 of them. We have the latitude and the longitude. And then there's actually, by using the cell ID and the LAC, I'm ahead of myself. So I apologize. Visualizing this, moving forward. I talk to myself. If you haven't noticed, I'll talk to myself this whole thing. I'm like a squirrel. I like the shiny objects. You know, the stare at 3 people is really hard when you're staring at 4 lights. So the lab testing. In the top left corner, there's the unauthenticated screen. Bottom left corner is the very difficult concept of clicking admin, change password, changing the password. On the right-hand side, you get to see a status screen. Now, I don't mean to blaze through that all fast because it's unimportant. It's a little bit sarcastic, but it's very serious as well. It has to be a very difficult problem if so many devices are still online and still vulnerable using default credentials with static IPv4 addresses on known cellular networks. Think of all the cellular networks you know. We listed 10 of them: Verizon, AT&T, Rogers, Tilius, Bell Mobility, Sprint PCS. Next, we have the logging configuration, which by default, the devices ship error only on all categories except for WAN/cellular. So what ends up happening is the logs, when you actually log in, no log is emitted. You change a setting, no logs emitted. Change the password, no logs emitted. Update any configuration we can find, it emits no logs. There's no log messages because they're all set to error only by default. Next, the only thing that we can find that it actually does successfully emit log messages for that seems very, very important is whenever it gets a new satellite fix. We have a satellite fix from 9 to 10, or we do a satellite fix from 5 to 6 or 3. It does emit logs for signal gain and signal loss, but nothing for admin, services, VPN, none of the tunnel information, none of the services or reporting or events that it's actually performing while you're connected to it. There's no logging whatsoever that's being emitted. It's a very real problem. Think about everything you essentially could do if you log into a device with default credentials and you make changes to devices that are sitting on the edge and remind you can be connected to anything. If you have something that can speak, but IP on like a traditional switched packet network, you can plug device in, network, plug your Raspberry Pi into USB and you can route through it that way. Don't even use Ethernet on your Raspberry Pi. It's very important. So what we ended up doing is we enumerated through all of our lab hosts using default credentials and started downloading their templates. And I apologize, but on the last slide, one thing that I didn't mention to you is you can download these configuration files. These configs are formed in XML. We're all quite familiar with XML. I know I'm really familiar with XML because I work for F5, so I use very large XML configuration files. And so you have the option of including passwords and also including device information. The problem with including the passwords, you might think that they're salted or in some way hashed. They're not, they're plain text. Radius, TACAX, WPA2, IPsec, all of your VPN tunnels, everything that you can find is also stored in plain text. So the important bit now is to go on to the idea of crawling devices. So we executed this in our lab. We crawled our 3 devices and we downloaded their configuration files. And from there, we started to parse them out for strings. And we looked at the manual and we thought, oh, there's some really neat information in here. We can start to tie things to model numbers and firmware versions and actual chipsets within the devices of Sierra's devices themselves. And then we wrote a parser so we could kind of do it a little bit faster. So we started rapidly making changes. You could reprogram them over the air and nobody would ever know because they don't log. So we essentially muck with each other. We would change configurations and crawl, parse, make configuration changes, crawl, parse over and over again. And we could never essentially find ourselves making our own changes. From there, once we had our lab up, we actually started to notice something that was really, really bizarre. The data point that I was telling you about, we started to change. Oh, I'm just not going to spoil it just yet. So we had the DNS attack. From there, we had the Sierra wireless device that we discovered. We began some research from our scanning. We set up a lab. And the pattern that we identified is because of that public display of latitude and longitude, we were actually start to see the devices were coming online and offline. They're going offline at regular or seemingly regular times. They come online, say 8 a.m., plus or minus 10, 15 minutes. They go offline, 5, 6, 7 p.m., plus or minus 10 minutes. And they'd have normal break schedules and stops in between. And mind you, this is public displayed latitude and longitudes. Seems pretty innocuous now, but looking at the devices these could be connected to, it gets a little different. So, example, Dr. Seuss says it best. I stole this from a poster on my son's wall. Oh, the places you shall go, and everyone can see them. It's very scary, actually. The lack in the cell ID that you can see on this slide, accompanying the latitude and longitude, if you're unfamiliar, it gives us the location area code, as well as some information about the tower and the antenna that it's talking to. And so from there, we've identified that we're pretty sure we have some shifts. So we started to essentially scrape more and more information off login pages, and from there, try to determine a hypothesis. So we had this pretty good hypothesis of what we thought we were dealing with. We had an idea that we were dealing with devices that had the ability to be mobile. Maybe that's people. You know, if you remember the story in Austin, Texas, at South by Southwest, there's like roaming hotspots that are people. Maybe these people have Sierras on their backs. We don't know. So we go to sierrawireless.com and we start evaluating their case studies. And the fortunate bit about all marketing departments and the way that we publish our use cases, F5 included, it's a wealth of information when you're starting to do research and what you're trying to find out about who's using what, when, and where. And so we actually took it, this thing is very sensitive in my hand. We took the liberty of identifying what customers we could, that they've spoke about. We didn't go as far as looking at tweets and really deep into blog posts. We wanted to get a general idea of what we could find out from Sierra, what they had to say essentially about their customers, their partners, and who's using these devices. So we built a map. Come on, it's a pretty map. I mean, let's be real. We've got a lot of blue dots. So the blue dots represent the top 300 most populated cities in the country. And then from there, we overlaid it with the data that we got from Sierra, which are the little, orange dots. There's not as many orange dots as blue dots. It doesn't mean that the problem isn't big. It doesn't mean that it's not real. The red outlines represent that in the state of Mississippi, the entire state for the Highway Transportation Safety Board, I believe it is, uses them statewide. In California, the California Highway Patrol uses them statewide. That's why we have those highlighted in red. Now the orange, you have Houston and Austin and Seattle, down in LA, Southern California, you have very major metropolitan areas, and which we now know not only from our own work, but we know from our work through what Sierra is delivering to us via their website, who these customers could be. It helps us kind of prove out this hypothesis, which we find very encouraging in 2017, so we push forward. We have now identified that we are dealing with fleets of vehicles. So we took all of this information that we've been scraping, the latitude and the longitudes, the cell information, everything that we could get that we could essentially be provided without having to authenticate against a device. From there, we started plugging it into a system called TrackCar. And TrackCar actually can support multiple formats. You can use TAIP data, which Sierra supports, NEMA, and other GPS formats. And those devices you can set up 5 profiles at most, and then we'll ship that GPS data to you under a number of circumstances. One being distance traveled, speed traveled. You can create triggers. This vehicle moves at more than 55 miles an hour in, 6 seconds, right? It's a quarter mile in under 8 seconds. We're finding drag racers or something. Let's go ahead and trigger. That would be the idea behind it. Now, the reality is that If you move more than 200 meters, send a message. It's been 30 seconds, send a message. Start to get this data. So on the right, we have everything that we collected from public latitude and longitudes. And then on the left, we have something very interesting. When we identified these fleet vehicles, we started to notice a pattern. And this pattern included, for example, you can participate. You have a vehicle that arrives at a donut shop, a Dunkin' Donuts. It stays there for 8 minutes. It then takes a 26-minute drive north to what now is a sheriff's station. From that sheriff's station, it then goes and works what we believe to be a beat. From that beat, it goes home. This visualization is representing a number of police officers in a metropolitan area that were able to be tracked live using public latitude and longitude data. I'm shaking, and I'm not nervous. We are tracking police. We are tracking police officers. This has moved far beyond the internet. I make this joke, and I mean it quite seriously. It's moving beyond the Internet of Things, and we are becoming the things of the internet. This affects all of us in ways that you can own. We have only put it in movies. We've now identified not only police officers, fire, medical, traffic cameras, traffic lights. The list goes on. You can essentially reroute traffic. You can reroute data. The Sierra Wireless devices allow you to change the DNS servers. You can imagine the man-in-the-middle possibilities that we can do with DNS. We can listen, we can take them offline. And worst is you cannot disable these, right? As a vigilante, if you're a vigilante, please don't do this. Don't go in and shut these down. You're taking off critical systems, critical infrastructure for us. And we're the critical infrastructure in this story. It's our lives. We are the people, the critical infrastructure in all of this. Yeah, I'm not saying that power meters and pumping stations and airplanes and cars and police officers are not important. They're very critical to our lives. But in my world, in my mind, we're very critical to this story. This isn't necessarily a story about just owning devices. It's us. It affects our lives. And so I don't know. You get it. No? All right. We have hydrogen cars. The way we know we have hydrogen cars, the way I learned we have hydrogen cars is we found hydrogen refueling stations. Lots of them in North America, actually. So there was this idea. Sometimes when you're doing research over the course of 22 months, you start to get a little antsy. And so I had this idea one night and thought, okay, if weak authentication can get me at the perimeter, what's behind it? So essentially took a peek. Weak authentication not only can get you into the perimeter, but weak authentication got me into services essentially behind the scenes. Surveillance system, point of sale system. I was told that should not have surprised me, but I'll be honest, it actually did. I was quite surprised to know that the services sitting behind this also were affected by weak authentication, frankly, because we know that third parties often install these Sierra devices and then essentially walk away. I've heard numerous stories about third parties configuring these and then essentially walking away, and the companies that are paying for them learn about it whenever they've been given a bill, they've sent 2,600 spam text messages. People own the devices, it's in spam. Don't even talk about that really in this talk, but I guess I just added it. There's a lot of other activities you can do with these other than what we list. But we found the hydrogen cars, and that was very important. It was 3 days after we started the research. And so, again, come back in time with me. October 25th of 2016, we sent over 400 disclosures. We got 0 responses in 3 days. 3 days wasn't a big deal. But the reason why we put the research down and had to kind of set it aside is without people responding, without people actually taking an interest in the fact that we're warning them that their networks are available, that we could identify all of these devices that are on their networks, part of their networks, gateways into their networks, doorways that allow people in very, very easily, we received no responses. It's very discouraging. It's actually heartbreaking because the list is very big. It includes probably a lot of you in this room. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it probably does. And so we came upon these worst case scenarios and all of this time that we had to be antsy and think about it. And so it allowed us to know where all of the law enforcement officers are at any time. Now I'm trying to say this in a scary voice, but my voice is hoarse, so I can't get the oomph to really get it out there and make it scary for you. But the reality is, as more and more communications are moving to more encrypted channels for all of these officers and all of these municipalities, who cares? We have GPS. Why be accurate to a beat, a zip code, a city. But you could be accurate to meters or feet, or depending on the device, less than feet. They're very accurate devices based on the radio they put on top. Additionally, you have back in 2016 going into 2017, there was over 150% rise in, and I always kind of get this wrong, but I believe they're called like ambush style killings. There were these assassination attempts against law enforcement officers. And so naturally, this scenario stuck out to us. This was very important back when we were doing this research. We were finding these topics in the news, and we know we're watching police officers. So you can imagine the kind of the goosebumps that go up your spine, or at least mine. And so we have GPS logging, and so we really thought, and I didn't speak to this earlier, but we started monitoring the behavioral profile of each device. And we were able to identify which ones are essentially people in vehicles, or people in buildings, or people driving through tolls, people watching tolls, bridges, billboards, etc. Follow-on attacks. We all see in the news, and this is very real, as you have EMS, emergency medical services, show up to a crime, to a scene, what ends up happening is they control ingress and egress. They have the ability to know who's coming, how they're coming, where they're coming from. You can see these devices. These devices, AKA people, ambulances, fire, police officers. And so you essentially are giving away, we're giving information that allows, and we take this very seriously in our research on the terrorism side, you actually are providing an ability for nation state actors to use this information, or not nation state actors, very vile, horrible people, to do very bad things as follow-up attacks. I wish I was better at scaring you. Like I could have brought a mask, I don't know, but these guys are all like, ooh, and you guys are all like, So, we have yet to find an industry that this doesn't touch. Cellular adoption rates from 2G to 4G LTE have been on the rise since 2014. 2G is still the predominant winner. There's a lot of 2G devices still out there. But 4G is coming, and we all know about 5G. This problem gets worse and worse with 5G. It becomes way worse in 5G. And so we have an opportunity now. If you're an underwater basket weaver, don't worry about it. You're cool. You're not going to have cellular down there. But if you're not, if you're in any other industry, any other industry that needs to be connected, constant connectivity, you're likely going to use cellular. And as we keep making advances in cellular technology, we're going to continue finding problems. This problem has existed at least since 2012. And so here we are, 2018. And you might be wondering, why did you wait so long to talk about it? Discouragement. 13,000 disclosures, more than 13,000 disclosures sent over 22 months. We've had 2 responses. 2. It's shameful, it's embarrassing. It's still heartbreaking, but there's one very good silver lining in it. We have a dialogue that we were able to start with Sierra Wireless. When Black Hat tweeted that we were doing this talk, when Black Hat put it up on the site, people started to listen a little more. So we have a little bit more attention. And so we've been able to work with Sierra and actually clarify numbers, clarify ways that we're finding things and validate it. And what's wonderful is they've essentially agreed with us. They know far better than I'm sure we do, but we've been able to collaborate and actually determine how many devices there are and what we can do to solve this problem. And so what ends up happening is we got to fix it. Seth Green, and I'm sorry for not remembering your name, these 2 gentlemen essentially on the slide to remind us of the Italian job. It's really funny as I think through this entire amount of research how many Italian job references there could be. You have Seth Green at the end, right? He's sitting on that airport, little baggage claim. He's on his fake brown keys and essentially manipulating the flow of traffic through a city. So this bank heist or gold heist from Edward Norton, whatever his name is, they can steal his money. And they were quite successful. That's not Hollywood fiction anymore, right? It's very real. Again, we found traffic cameras, traffic lights. These devices sit in the middle. What can we do about it? We all have friends, we all know colleagues, we all have peers. Reach out to your peers. They run these devices, scan the networks. Essentially change the password immediately. That's step 1. If you go to any of the advisories that Sierra has released, change the password. And essentially upgrade the firmware. If you don't want to be vulnerable to the insecure firmware updater that got Mirai on the boxes to begin with, And then as well as Reaper in April of this year, they released another advisory, then upgrade the firmware. Third, configure the management interface. If you're going to leave the default password, at least use trusted IPs, whitelist the IPs, put an ACL, put an access control list on the actual device, on the management interface you plan on using to be silly. You can be a little bit better, you can be a little bit more silly then. But if we find you, we'll still call you out. And second of all, just don't use Telnet, use SSH, right? Move from Telnet to SSH, get off default ports, don't use standard certificates, change passwords, configure the logging to give you something more than just whenever you get 10 satellites instead of 9 satellites, because I'm sure that doesn't actually matter to you. If you do have to display information like public latitude and longitude and cell information, you absolutely need to make sure you block that off from the public, using ACLs to restrict the access. At least use a VPN tunnel. I hope I did not blaze through this too incredibly fast. But one thing I've learned is there's usually a lot of questions as I've started to tell this story over time. And I think with that, I am Shat on Twitter. I hope that you all understand the gravity of this situation. If my voice was fully with me, I would be trying to scare you much, much more, but not to sell fear. It's the fact that we have data that represents this. So I'd like to thank everybody from F5 Networks as well as Lorica and interns that actually helped contribute to this body of work. And also I'd like to be able to take any questions if anybody has any. Thank you. I don't even know how much time I have left.
Early.
Okay. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, there's a wrap room. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We have do I have 5 minutes?
I mean, you have time.
Okay.
But if they want to answer, go now.
Hey, man, that's a record for me.
You're told 35.
Okay.
Did the Highway Patrol fix their stuff?
Did the California Highway Patrol fix their stuff? I know the CHP has had a number of pen tests since 2016. I didn't break down whether or not the CHP had devices in the scan list. It's also probably not a good idea to specifically call out which ones are always still vulnerable, but I would be surprised if they did. That's the easiest way to put it. But no, I haven't checked, honestly, to be able to give you a definitive answer. I wish I could. It's a good question. Please.
Have you had any success on detecting Cirrus Wireless cards through an APN as opposed to some of the other methods that you were using?
Through APM, not as much. We did identify a lot of devices from some visibility into traffic that we can see that's on 1919 space. And so there's far more devices. It's just what's available publicly and what essentially is not. Additionally, we were reporting closer to 600,000 devices initially, but we were covering a larger swath. We were essentially including all of their OEM chips that they were releasing out to partners like Dell and Cradlepoint in theirs. And we're not saying that those are not vulnerable or that they are vulnerable, but as far as the APM, we didn't actually measure it outside of it.
Okay. So these were just regular cell devices with publicly available IP addresses.
Yeah, so essentially when you buy the device, when you get the data plan, you end up getting a static address, say from Verizon, they give you a static IPv4 address that's in there. And it's really important to companies like Verizon and AT&T because it just starts to eat at their spectrum, right? It's a very real problem for cellular providers. It's not necessarily eating at bandwidth and stealing bandwidth and too many packets. They have this whole spectrum of their communication, and this is just essentially tens of thousands of devices that are pulling away from that, eating into it. But I can try to maybe run some queries and give you an answer.
Yeah, that would be.
You can hit me up.
Yeah, I will do that. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. Please.
Good morning. Is this problem the same on Verizon wireless devices?
You mean like Verizon MiFi's?
The ones that electric utilities use out on the field? Cellular gateways?
So a lot of the devices that are in use, if it's using a Sierra wireless chip, there's some probability, but we're speaking to this 5 or 6 models that we included in it. They're actually if you remember the image, they're the full gateways They're much larger than like the air cards. But I know from a former experience, we used them in pumps and essentially in like the control equipment for all the ICS and SCADA data that was for all their SCADA systems that went for these pumps that we were operating, and they were used there. And so I'd be surprised if they weren't. But I don't know specifically if Verizon's branded Verizon specific modems, their cellular gateways are included in this. We didn't look for any Verizon equipment specifically. We just
And
know
you
that-
mentioned on one of your slides that using a VPN tunnel helps, but I mean, you also need to turn off the GPS disclosure, right?
Right. Those features like the publicly displayed GPS, the latitude, longitude, cell information, it's important to know none of that's on by default. We found tens of thousands of devices that turned that on optionally, intentionally. It's not a default configuration, but yeah, I would not enable that unless you have a really good reason.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Hi.
Hi. For some of these organizations like the Highway Patrol, doesn't it make sense for them to be able to track where their cars are at, like, or individuals are at any given point for safety reasons?
Absolutely.
I mean, there's also other safety precautions, but
It's a great question. It's absolutely essential for dispatchers and other police officers to know where their fellow colleagues are. I mean, they're, police brethren, and, we're brothers and sisters in the fraternal order of police. They want to know where all these people are. I'm not supposed to know where they are. You are not supposed to know where they are. Somebody in Africa is not supposed to know where they are. And it's not just know where they are, it's know where they are every moment of every day, 24 hours a day, and very, very, very specifically. So it's at least to the 7th, I believe, digit or int in GPS. So one more is down. I don't know what we get down to, but it's much more specific if we add one more digit. But any other questions?
Wouldn't you say that probably every radio has this problem? And why do radios in general have web servers in them? And why don't you push to make it so you configure all radios with SSH instead of web servers?
One, I do not work for Sierra Wireless. I have been working very closely with them. It's been really, really wonderful. I'll bring it up. Why do this? Actually, I do know that the web configuration screen, and I apologize for not bringing this up in the talk, it's in much more other subsequent material that we publish. The web configuration GUI really shouldn't be publicly available in any way. The config GUI you see where you log in and you get the status page, you get the information about everything that's happening with the device. It's not supposed to necessarily be public. It was. It wasn't until very recently. So if you email security at sierrawireless.com, if you have one of these devices, they'll actually help you move on if you've been infected to their cloud platform, and that takes away that interface. The problem is they've been offering that for quite some time, years, and people have not started, not everyone's picked up on it yet. And so to the question as to why they have interfaces in them to begin with, is for just to make it intuitive for administrators to be able to configure these devices. I mean, I really doubt that the same guys configuring Arista switches and Juniper MX 240s are out configuring Sierra Wireless devices in the field, so they need to make it easy. It also helps to have a templated configuration with a very easy upload kind of idea that people can get to them. So, I hope did I grab all your questions? Wonderful.
I had a quick question. Of course, it has a web interface. What about a CLI interface? Command line interface?
There is a CLI interface.
So it's just as accessible as a web interface and probably got a little more breadth to it.
Yeah, so you have, essentially you could tell that into the device. The default port was 2332. I used to advertise a banner. It would help us identify it. But once you were in, you could issue essentially commands to send text messages and do various other things. I had a slide if you guys want to, I can't zoom into it, but essentially on the status screen, they'll have like an AT command to the left of all of the features within the interface that you can use via Telnet or SSH or the command line. But the command line, once they fix the firmware uploader, and it was no longer insecure and you could arbitrarily run code, that should have gone away. Yeah.
Hey, Justin.
What's up, man?
My question is more when you went to the vendor there. When you report something like this to a vendor, they always say thanks, but it can be thanks or it can be thanks, right?
Or it can be, thank you, we're going to play the quiet game and see
Yes.
who can win.
And I'm curious to know how they responded Because in my experience, it has a lot to do with kind of the viewpoints of the management and how serious they actually saw this, or how much convincing and security Bible thumping did you have to do?
I didn't go thumping. I firmly believe the problem scope and the evidence that was sent with the disclosures would speak to the problem enough. For example, hypothetically, if we were to raise and lower a bridge and send it to somebody in that city, you would believe they'd find it very important because you should not be able to raise and lower bridges. Not saying it happens, I'm just saying it could. Now, we send out standard disclosures. The problem is we're kind of one step removed. We couldn't identify every organization because so many were associated with like 1/9 within this company leasing out to Verizon. And so it got really complicated. It's actually a process that needs to be improved. It's one of the biggest problems we have, or one of the biggest problems I think many of us have, but especially with this case. So many of these companies were oblivious that they even had the devices, and it came down to we had to prove it. And then once we tried to prove it, it just essentially fizzled out because whoever we were trying to essentially approve it to, it never really went anywhere. And so when I say zero up until 2018, I really mean it. We had one essentially try to respond, but somehow instead of responding to us, they responded to like somebody 4 steps away from us. And so it never even made it back. They just, I guess, Googled some stuff and thought that that's who they should respond to. So, what's up, man?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have 2 questions. You mentioned that VPN as a mitigation plan. Do any of these devices have built-in VPN capabilities, or does this mean that you have to install something else that does your VPN tunneling for you?
All of them support VPN tunnels. They support a variety of VPN tunnel types as well, like IPsec.
Okay, so it's just a matter of using the functionality.
Right, they're not using it.
And you mentioned that they now have some cloud-based management thing instead.
Yeah, I believe it's called like AVMS.
Okay.
So it essentially is their unified platform.
Is this something that Sierra hosts, or does the client need to host its own?
Sierra hosts it, I believe.
Does this create like a single point of failure? Can it be DDoSed and then it prevents everyone from managing their stuff?
Honestly, I can only surmise or maybe state some assumptions, but I don't have any specific answers to how it works. I actually asked for a preview of it myself, so I'm hoping to get one in the next couple of weeks. But being that we didn't really start to get attention until July 28th, and today it's August 9th, I haven't had exactly a lot of time to fit in more work with Sierra. But yeah, hit me up on Twitter, man. As soon as I know I can share it with you, I'd be happy to.
Sure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah.
First, I would like to comment on configuration management of a bunch of radios, right? If I'm, let's say I work for a utility or muni, I buy the radios, I own them. Who manages the radios? Do you buy a DMS to manage the radios? Do you count on Sierra managing it for you, or are you going to do it yourself?
Right.
Oh, okay, sorry, but that's, okay.
It's a good question. It's who's responsible for these devices. I'm a municipality. I have a police force of 800 officers.
Yeah.
We have 800, police cruisers, 200 support staff, who knows, however many SWAT vans and paddy wagons.
But if they do a deal with Sierra to manage it, then, then is it a single point of failure? You have to have that discussion,
I would have that I would definitely encourage you to have that discussion with them. It's a very important, requirement of whatever your deployment's going to be.
I agree.
I can't imagine Sierra being, I do want to remind everyone, this is not a hardware defect or a software defect in Sierra. They did not build a crap product. They didn't build something that's just awful, right? It's just as much a user configuration problem as it is our industry's problem as a Sierra problem. Yeah. And so I'm sure there's other options. There's actually lots of fleet management options. There's even open source. Yeah. So there's a variety of.
Okay, so just the last question would be, so again, let's say I'm a muni, I've got 800 officers. Why is this network not on Verizon private? Are these publicly exposed IP addresses?
Yes, they're publicly exposed.
Why would I do that?
Go ask them. This is exactly what we need to be talking about. Why? Why are we on public IP addresses? Why are we not using VPNs? Verizon, help us. Why are we doing this? And on Verizon's side, just say like Spectrum. Bring up the word Spectrum. Apparently, I just learned this, but. If anybody in here is Verizon, Spectrum, I'm using the word that's supposed to get attention. So We want to help. We're the good guys and we're here to help.
Yeah.
And it's just finding people who are as interested as you are and like, hey, I want to help. I'm immunity. I have this problem. Let's do something about it. So I appreciate the question.
okay.
If you have any more, I'd be happy to answer in the wrap-up room. I think we're out of time. Oh. You guys want 5 minutes of your life back or you got more questions? I'm happy to keep going.